Thank you very much, Megan, for that kind introduction. It's really such a thrill to be here, and I'm very grateful to Trinita and her colleagues here at the Frist for inviting me to come and talk. And Michelangelo is one of my favorite subjects. Like, you know, the drawings next door are just some of his greatest works, and it's you know, many of them are old friends to me, but it's wonderful to see them again and installed so beautifully here. Really, a fabulous show that I hope you'll enjoy for the next 3 months. So Michelangelo, or Big Mike, as one of my colleagues calls him, this is a portrait of him drawn by his associate Daniele da Volterra about 1560. And, obviously you know him and his works, which are so very famous, the Sistine Ceiling, the David, the Pietà, the Doni Tondo at upper left, and the entrance to the Laurentian Library, lower right. And, he's one of the sort of longest lived artists of the Renaissance. He died, age 88 in 1564, which was a really grand old age in that period. And, so consistently productive throughout that time. And at the center of all his practice, all the works, all the masterpieces that he produced was drawing, which in Italian, disegno, means not just the act of drawing, but really the act of creation and bringing an idea together in your mind. And this is, I think, just such a charming sheet. It's in the British Museum. And Michelangelo didn't have pupils as such, and he always wanted to sort of work solo on projects, in contrast to every other Renaissance artist. But he did, however, teach a few noblemen how to draw. And this is a sheet where he teaches the young Antonio Mini how to draw. He made these two little sketches here for Mini to copy. And Mini obviously was very idle and didn't copy them. And so Michelangelo wrote this little note on the sheet to him, and it says, "Disegna, Antonio, disegna, draw, Antonio, draw. Draw and do not waste time. Draw e non perdere tempo." And so he's drawing is just so central for him and absolutely a crucial part of everything that he does and did. In the exhibition next door, you'll see this sheet. One of his most beautiful works. I mean, it's incredible to me now that we have about 600 drawings in the world by Leonardo da Vinci. And that's a fraction of what he probably produced. He probably made, estimates vary between about 6,000 and 10,000 drawings. And, for any Renaissance artist, in the end, they're just sheets of paper that have lasted 500 years. And so often, there are just accidents of survival that shape the way the corpus has come down to us and what there is, what remains. For Michelangelo, a few of his sheets were collected, actively collected in his lifetime because he was so famous. And so that sort of helps their chance of survival. But in his case, there's a reason why we have so little. And he burnt them. It seems so amazing to us now, where they're such precious objects and we value them so highly. But Michelangelo was incredibly jealous of his creations, and he was consistently concerned about people sort of stealing his ideas, looking at his working process. The great Renaissance biographer Giorgio Vasari said that he burned his drawings to keep the ideas from others. And it's one of the great sort of tragedies. His nephew Leonardo Buonarroti, who inherited what was left and who inherited the house in Florence, the Casa Buonarroti, from whom these drawings in the exhibition, from where they come. He said that Michelangelo, at the end of his life, made 2 huge bonfires of his drawings in Rome, and burned, basically the contents of his Roman studio. And it's recorded there were only literally 2 drawings left in his house in Rome when he died. And this practice began even early, in 1518, much earlier in his career. Michelangelo's dedicated associate, Leonardo Celaio, records that he very regretfully burned dozens of cartoons for the Sistine ceiling. That's fully prepared transfer drawings for the Sistine ceiling. And he burned them all before Michelangelo left Rome. And Michelangelo, is a figure that comes and goes between Rome and Florence. And we have a lot of drawings from his Florentine period, up to about 1534. And those are the ones that generally remain in the Casa Buonarroti and that were preserved. But after that period, there are just big gaps. And clearly those are the ones that never made it. So this afternoon, I'd just like to look at the drawings that remain and through the lens, really, of the media through which they're drawn. So I'd like to look firstly as a case study at the Battle of Cascina, one of his big commissions in about 1504, and then just look sequentially at the media, pen and ink and wash, red chalk, black chalk, and drawings made in a sort of mix of media, ensemble of media, just as a way into the corpus that remains and as an insight into his practice. And we'll begin with the Battle of Cascina. This work came out of a commission made for the leaders of Florence at the time in about 1495, just after the Medici had been thrown out of the city, the ruling family thrown out of the city. And this was the Palazzo della Signoria, which you may recognize, at the center of Florence. It occupies this sort of crucial strategic position and an ancient medieval building that was the seat of power in Florence. After the Medici were thrown out, the city was ruled by it seems like sort of ultimate democracy, but 1,000 people sort of taken from around the city, and they needed a large council chamber for this group to meet in. And so they made this huge room that they're called the Sala del Gran Consiglio, the room of the Great Council. And they wanted to decorate this room, with works by the greatest artists alive at the time. And they were Michelangelo and Leonardo, and they happened to be both in Florence at that period. There's always been this tradition in Florence of pitting one artist against another and making competitions and thereby encouraging artists to produce their very greatest works. And the prospect of having Michelangelo and Leonardo competing must have really exercised them. Not least because they were already rivals and they really disliked each other. Vasari records this in 1550 and said that there was no love lost between them. And an anonymous account of 1540 talks about an incident between them. It's one of very few accounts that records it, As Leonardo was passing the Palazzo Spini, which is pictured here, close by the Church of Santa Trinita, several notables were there assembled, who were discussing a passage in Dante, and seeing Leonardo, they bade him come and explain it to them. At the same moment, Michelangelo passed, and on one of the crowd calling to him, Leonardo said, "Michelangelo will be able to tell you what it means." To which the latter, thinking that this had been said to entrap him, replied, "No, explain it yourself, horse modeler that you are," who, unable to cast a statue in bronze, was forced with shame to give up the attempt. So saying, he turned his back on them and left. And another time, Michelangelo, wishing to bite Leonardo, said to him, "And those turkeys of Milanese really believed in you?" And this is all, because of Leonardo's unfinished project for the Sforza monument, the equestrian monument in Milan. And clearly a sort of sore point and something that Michelangelo, thought he could really get to him with. The rivalry also boiled over when it came to the placement of Michelangelo's famous statue of David. In January 1504, the city convened a council of all the famous artists, all the best-known artists in Florence, to discuss the placement of this statue. And there were two options. One was a very prominent place right outside the door of the Signoria. The other was a really tucked away, hidden place underneath the Loggia dei Lanzi on the side there. Leonardo da Vinci was also on this committee, and he argued strongly it should be in the more tucked away, hidden place. And we have this drawing by Leonardo at Windsor, where he just sketches the David and transforms him into a fountain of Neptune. And Leonardo actually also was one of several artists who said, "Oh, the nudity was clearly too much, and it should be covered over." And so, he and the several artists actually forced them to make some bronze drapery that would cover the David's genitalia for that early period. So he's very much, just trying to sort of hamstring Michelangelo at every point. And of course, Michelangelo in the end sort of won. Like, the statue was placed prominently outside the Signoria, and that's where the copy of it that we now know is there today, and the original now in the Galleria dell'Accademia. So the prospect of having these two, key artists in Florence competing on commissions for this great council chamber must have been extraordinary. And this is all that remains. Neither of the works were finished. They're now only known through these copies. This is the Michelangelo work, and this is what remains, or what we know of the Leonardo work. And I just want to look into this commission just a little bit to see how these two artists used the black chalk, red chalk, pen and ink as part of their project. Leonardo was the first to be commissioned in October 1503, and he decided he would treat the subject of the Battle of Anghiari in 1440. He chose the central episode of the capture of the standard, that you see the fierce fighting. And he said he really wanted to convey the terror and the noise and the dust of battle. And of course, he was somebody who was well acquainted with this in working for the Milanese, working for the Sforza. The city was invaded by the French in 1499. And, Leonardo was pressed into action designing basically weapons of mass destruction for the Milanese. So, you have these amazing drawings, these sort of chariots with scythes on the wheels. And, Leonardo knew about battle and was well acquainted with, its results and the engines of war that could be used. To prepare for his fresco, he made these very brief sketches in pen and ink, very fluent, really capturing the energy of battle. And then he also made these now famous studies in chalk, a black chalk study for the shouting head there. As we know, Leonardo was particularly interested in expression. And so you get these wonderful drawings of his that really, investigate the human physiognomy and the emotion behind what is happening. He also used red chalk freely to make these some wonderful sketches of horses, as you see these fantastic pentimenti, these changes that he made in the front legs of the horse there that seems to be sort of wheeling around. And Leonardo, did endless studies of horses towards this commission to really convey the fierceness of the battle. And a red chalk study here, and red chalk, as it had never been used before, really used incredibly subtly, with a light touch and with a lot of use of stumping, which was using a rolled up piece of leather with a sort of domed head, and you would tap it on the red chalk to spread the particles. And that's what enabled him to get these very subtle gradations. And these drawings were incredibly influential on Michelangelo. Leonardo's commission, as I say, never came into being. This is a copy of what he ended up painting in the Sala del Gran Consiglio. And so, he got to paint a certain amount of it, but just as with the Last Supper in Milan, he used this experimental media of sort of essentially dry tempera painted directly on the wall. And it was already beginning to peel off, even in his lifetime. And in the end, it was painted over by Giorgio Vasari, probably in the 1540s or so. And there are now these attempts to try and find it underneath Vasari's painting. They think it's still there, this little piece of Leonardo. But it's a difficult one because we don't actually know where in the room it was painted. And obviously you have to sort of semi-destroy some of the Vasari work to get to what's underneath. Michelangelo intended something very different. And he was commissioned, it was almost a year later to paint his painting. And so Leonardo had a head start, but it meant that Michelangelo would have known something of what Leonardo intended and would have seen some of the drawings that Leonardo had made, some of the ones I've shown you. But Michelangelo instead was asked to depict the Battle of Cascina from 1364, the Florentines' last great victory over the Pisans. And while he had components of a battle scene, the main commission was all about basically the human figure. And this is what really drove Michelangelo, the amazing variations with which you could portray the human figure, the male figure. And so he chose a moment when the Florentine army were attacked, and they were at rest and bathing in a river. And so he chooses this moment where he can display them all naked, and he can display them all putting their clothes on and attitudes, strapping on their armor, and prepared for suddenly getting into the battle, which they then subsequently won. He also made a few studies in pen and ink towards this commission. This is one for a battle scene. He clearly planned to have a battle scene at the background. And you can see here this very loose little pen sketch of a battle scene. And this much more complete one in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. And you can see here the rearing horse and the warriors underneath, and this hatching that he uses. And clearly in drawings like this, he was driven by seeing Leonardo's very fluent studies in pen and ink for his own battle scene. He also used pen and ink for some of his figure studies at this period, in contrast to Leonardo da Vinci. And this is wonderful pen and ink study with a little white heightening just for the sheen of the water on the body for this central figure. And he used black chalk for, I hope you can see this, it's a little faint, but black chalk for the only compositional study that we know for this intended fresco. And it's black chalk. You can see some elements of this prominent figure here is already in the composition. And this is the sort of drawing that we just hardly know today. For every single Renaissance artist, it's the sort of drawing that was just thrown away, destroyed. People didn't value these drawings at the time, and the drawings they valued were head studies, complete figure studies, and complete composition studies. Michelangelo also used black chalk to make, for his figure studies, and these, made in several different tones of black chalk, sometimes strengthened by wetting, and really very, very dynamic. Already anticipating the composition, he knows where everything's going, so he doesn't really bother with this leg because he knows it's going to be covered. And it's all about the torso and managing to convey that in a realistic manner. So this, in the end, this is in the end what survives, and we just know these compositions through these copies that were made. Benvenuto Cellini, the sculptor, said in his biography, his autobiography, that these two cartoons, the two large-scale finished transfer drawings, became, quote, the drawing school of the world. And so there are endless copies of elements of these compositions. And all Florentine artists and artists who flocked from overseas to study these great commissions would study these compositions. I'd like to just go through, some of the different media that Michelangelo used here specifically, and just get into more detail about how he used them. Michelangelo was apprenticed to the artist Domenico Ghirlandaio in the 1490s. And this is a Ghirlandaio fresco from about 1490 and shows Ghirlandaio's pen and ink drawing style. Clearly, a lot of hatching and cross-hatching, really used, within outlines to model the form. And this is where Michelangelo learned to draw in pen and ink, basically. So this on the right is a Michelangelo sheet. And it seems to be drawn in 2 tones of ink. It's in the British Museum. It seems to represent a philosopher or something. We don't actually know the purpose for which it was made. But one of the extraordinary things to me, it always sort of warps my mind every time I think about it, but all of these drawings, when they were first made, were black, in black ink. The ink was black. And we're now so used to seeing them as this sort of mellow brown, chocolatey brown. And, to think of them all as this dense black when they were made is sort of difficult to conceive. But the reason that this seems to be in 2 different tones is that the ink was made by dissolving gall nuts, which grow on oak trees. They were used by the tree to sort of cover growths on the tree. And the nuts were then harvested and infused in copper sulfate or iron sulfate. And that would then obviously produce slightly different inks every single time. So presumably Michelangelo went back to the sheet several times. And you have these slightly different densities of ink. Michelangelo always, particularly later in life, was very keen to deny that he ever had a teacher. And he tried to, pretend that he only learned by copying other people, by studying, hard studying, and he was never actually, taught. And so he, in his sort of authorized biography by Ascanio Condivi, he doesn't mention any of his time with Ghirlandaio, and he just says how he learned to copy learned from studying and copying Masaccio. So you have here a couple of Michelangelo's studies after Masaccio, again with this dense cross-hatching that he learned from Ghirlandaio, and leaving elements of the composition just with the outlines, with these free use of the pen and ink as well. This is a drawing that's in the exhibition of some drapery, and I put it in just to remind us that you can't see it awfully well in the slide, but you can see it really well in the drawing, that they were made often over black chalk. And, if you're drawing in the period, then it made so much sense to actually use black chalk first to sketch out the composition, because black chalk could be erased. And you would use a bit of, normally a bit of stale bread or breadcrumbs as an eraser then to erase that. Whereas obviously once you begin in pen and ink, then it's fixed and it's there. But again, you have these very dense cross-hatching, which was very suitable for conveying the drapery for this figure. Also, of course, we should remember the pen and ink he used for this figure study. And, pen and ink at the time was used much more freely by other artists. So you have here a study by Raphael for the Bridgewater Madonna of about 1506, about the same period. And you just see how freely Raphael is using it. And Leonardo as well, with these, this is a sheet that's in the Getty Museum in our own collection. And lots of studies for a Christ child with a lamb. And there are lots of little black chalk studies that he then goes over in pen and ink. And Michelangelo sometimes approaches this in this sheet, which is in the exhibition here, maybe studies for Transfiguration. And you can see that there are elements studied in black chalk, which he then goes over in the pen and ink to to just literally just capture the figures in very simple ink lines. And, these drawings were made with a quill. I mean, it's so difficult it's difficult enough, frankly. Well, certainly, I try and draw and I give up every time. It's so difficult. And it's difficult enough to draw in pen and ink now, but if you imagine you're using a goose quill sharpened to a point and you're dipping it in ink, to judge the amount of ink you're getting, how much is going to go on the page, how it's, the weight of line becomes incredibly important, how hard you press with the quill, how much ink it's going to release. And, these sort of sketches, which seem so very simple, actually just takes so much skill, and more skill than we can imagine nowadays. And of course, Michelangelo is using the pen and ink for letters as well, and he's using them for diagrams for the blocks of marble he wants for sculpture. So for instance, this is a sketch now in the British Museum he's ordering blocks of marble from Carrara for a river god for the new sacristy in Florence. And you can see he's just written on the dimensions. He has this very rudimentary sketch, these two rudimentary sketches of the figures as they would be. And he's also using it for architectural studies, as you can see here, for the facade of San Lorenzo. And he's using it with wash for the fortification studies that he made. We have a couple of beautiful ones in the exhibition, where he uses obviously the pen and ink for the outline and for these wonderful sort of working out where the artillery can fire and go. But he then uses this wash, literally a dilute mixture of the iron gall ink, made into the wash and applied for with a brush and filled in there to make the ground plan. Sometimes he would draw literally in just chalk and wash. So the central motif here in this drawing is made with the wash over black chalk. And I love these pools of wash applied so sort of intuitively with the brush here as well in this this design for the ceiling of San Lorenzo, where he's presenting two different possibilities for the patron. A blank coffer and coffers filled with sculpture. And of course, back to his project for the Laurentian Library at the end of the 1520s, you again get this extensive use of wash in these architectural drawings, and the pen and ink used and in conjunction with the writing as well. And the amazing thing is that Michelangelo basically then just abandons pen and ink, and it becomes something he hardly uses in the last 30 years of his life. Occasionally he'll use it for architectural studies, and that's it. And in the biography that Condivi writes, this authorized biography, he says, "Oh yes, I only used pen and ink in my youth because that was all that was available." But actually, it wasn't all that was available. But it's funny that he, in remembering back, just considers pen and ink something he used as a child, as he would have put it, as a youth. So we move on to red chalk. And this medium yields really, I think, some of the most beautiful drawings made in the Italian Renaissance, and sheets like this made by Michelangelo. And this one's in the exhibition. Made just like Leonardo was using those, for the head that you saw in his study for the Battle of Anghiari. Just incredible, modeled with incredible subtlety, using this stump, tapping the particles away and around, rubbing it with your finger. Occasionally, licking the end of the chalk and just to give you some slightly darker area, which would just darken the chalk and give you that extra little bit of sort of oomph where you need it in the outline. And then this wonderful subsidiary study of the eye with longer eyelashes. And this is a case, one of innumerable cases in Michelangelo's drawing where he uses a male model. This is clearly one of his workshop assistants for a female figure. So this is a copy in the National Gallery in London of a Michelangelo painting that was lost in the 17th century, or destroyed in the 17th century, of Leda and the Swan. And you can see how, this drawing is clearly the study for the figure of Leda, of this female figure. And one really gets a sense that Michelangelo, in drawing, he's drawing his assistants. They adopt any pose he wants, and then he just morphs it in the painting into a female figure or whatever he wants, basically. Red chalk was also used for his studies at the time. When he was working for the project of the Laurentian Library, he hadn't done much architecture before, so he went back to studying sort of textbooks of architecture, and this is a drawing in the exhibition showing that, and just showing where, again, it's from the 1520s, and he has that understanding of the weight of line and the density that you can get with red chalk. It is a naturally occurring medium, so it will vary a lot. He would use red chalk also for his teaching. We saw that drawing right at the beginning that he made for Antonio Mini in pen and ink. This is a drawing that he made for another nobleman called Andrea Quaratesi. And it's in the Ashmolean Museum where I used to work. And now specialists believe that this is the only study of an eye by Michelangelo, and that these are all then studies by his pupils or by Andrea Quaratesi. Again, one of these charming inscriptions that he made at the bottom, where he says, Andrea abbi pazienza, Andrea, have patience. And somebody's underneath has written, for it gives me consolation. And Andrea here is just practicing his signature, doodling in the corner, Andrea Quara, and the sheet has been cut at the right-hand side there. In red chalk, Michelangelo also made studies such as this for the Doni Tondo, this famous round painting in the Uffizi. This figure sort of looking up, incredibly difficult pose to draw. Those of you who draw will recognize just how the foreshortening is so difficult to get. And here, the red chalk, it's all about the weight of line and how you can make the chin sort of appear in the foreground, but then have the figure sort of disappearing, gradually going back into space. And, he doesn't care at all about the back of the head. He doesn't care about the neck or clothing. It's all about studying the face and the way that it is conveyed in space. Another drawing in the exhibition is this study in pen and ink for the leg of the Christ child. And it's interesting to me that, he'll make some studies in red chalk at the time, some in pen and ink. This is early, about 1506. But he just, we don't know, of course, why he chooses one over the other here. And, is it just that he had a pen in his hand and he's like, oh, well, let's think about that? Or, there happened to be no chalk lying around, or his student was using it, or, who knows? But again, used in the same way, with an outline and a few hatched lines that would then model the space in between. Some of his greatest red chalk drawings are the drawings that relate to the Sistine ceiling. And this very famous, obviously, creation of Adam, and the drawing that relates to it in the British Museum. And, what's wonderful when he deals with red chalk in this way, this, around 1511 here, a little bit later, but how he can really study the muscles of the figure, and how he's really extracting the figure from the paper. To me, it's so difficult to imagine with sheets like this, that this was once a blank sheet of paper, and that somebody's done this, somebody's made this figure on the sheet. And it's just incredible how fluently Michelangelo could draw, could render the figure, get what he wants. He's not studying the head, because he'll make another study of that, but he's really studying the torso and the muscles. And you see the the multiple lines here for the leg. He's just, just searching for the form from the paper. And again, the hand, he studies the hand, but he doesn't really study the arm, because that's in sort of shadow and heavily foreshortened, so you just don't see much of it. Also in red chalk, a few architectural studies. This is a lovely sheet in the exhibition. And it's sort of ghostly, this wonderful red chalk study of a blind window that sort of comes through, and probably relating to the Laurentian Library, the blind windows that he made there. But with this letter on the back, and the ink, the iron gall ink, one of the problems with it was that because it's made with a sort of acid, it's made with these iron sulfate, is that it eats through the paper sometimes, depending on the strength of the mixture. And so you can see here, it's the letter that's on the back of the sheet has eaten through the paper, and it sort of then makes this amazingly ghostly form of the window that seems to sort of shine through somehow. And Michelangelo then uses red chalk again up till about 1534 or so, and he's using it like a pen too sometimes, very brief studies, and then really quick sketches that outline the density, the weight of a figure. And this is a sheet that's in the exhibition. I can't leave discussing red chalk without mentioning Andrea del Sarto, and I'd give another plug for my exhibition which is at the Frick Collection in New York of Andrea del Sarto, artist working at the same time as Michelangelo, but who now is unknown, totally unknown, even though at the time he was absolutely as famous. And wonderful use of red chalk here in a head study, and this very schematic use of red chalk at the end of his life in 1528. And this is really, Andrea del Sarto was really the artist who popularized red chalk in Florentine drawing. He had endless pupils, people like Pontormo, Rosso, Salviati, Vasari, who really drove Florentine drawing in the 1500s. And it was, him that really brought red chalk to prominence as like the drawing medium for artists in Italy. And you can just see here one of his paintings, the Madonna of the Steps, with a variety of studies for it. And I just wanted to show this to make the point that, red chalk is a naturally occurring medium. And so it comes in all different tones. You literally dig it out of the ground, and some will be pinker, some will be redder, some will be more orangey. And this, it makes it interesting, and it frankly makes a nightmare when you're doing a publication. I'm trying to color-proof all the different subtle types of red that you have in the red chalk, and trying to make sure they're all accurate and reflect the original drawing. So to move on to black chalk. And black chalk was clearly Michelangelo's favorite drawing medium, particularly for the last 30 years of his life or so. And it's a medium that had been around from early in his career. I mean, this drawing is by Perugino, dates to 1470. It's in the British Museum. Such a beautiful sheet, and it shows how even before Leonardo, artists are using black chalk with incredible subtlety. And Michelangelo really picks up on this in his studies for the Battle of Cascina, in these figure studies. But of course, using it for an entirely different purpose in the compositional studies. And this is one thing, when you look at a drawing, it's absolutely crucial to consider the purpose of it, the function. And so you have, obviously, if he's just making a preliminary sketch for the composition, it's going to be very brief and quick. Whereas if he's trying to study muscles and glistening sort of flesh, then obviously it's going to be a much more highly finished, highly worked drawing. With black chalk, I love this particular sheet. It's a study after the antique, after an antique sculpture. And the drawing's in the British Museum. But I don't know if you can see from where you are, but he uses these very, lots and lots of very short lines of hatching to model the figure. And it reminds me exactly of how he uses the claw chisel in his sculptures, the claw chisel which literally just scrapes away the marble. And that's the sense that you get here. And, he's looking at a sculpture, and so he's somehow thinking of it in these sort of sculptural terms. But he could also draw, incredibly subtly and using a lot of, stumping and rubbing with the finger of this portrait, one of very few portrait drawings that he made. And this is actually Andrea Quaratesi, the student who was practicing his signature a bit earlier. And again, one of very few studies, but you can see how subtly he uses the black chalk here with the white of the paper left for the highlights, and really thinking about the shadow, thinking about the fall of light on the face. He also uses black chalk just as he did with red chalk, just like the pen. So this sketch from the exhibition that is very brief, probably for a figure of a risen Christ. And you have this whirl of legs. It's wonderful. He's got the sort of dynamism in the main figure in the top half, and the bottom half is like there are about 8 legs. And he's just considering and discarding every single time how the legs can be and how he can capture that dynamism in the legs. And the same here with a drawing that we consider probably for a low relief sculpture. But again, he'll study aspects of this pose, lots of pentimenti, lots of little changes in the face and in the figure of Isaac, this study of the sacrifice of Isaac with Abraham and the angel who then just saves him from sacrificing his only son. And black chalk he also uses in his architectural studies, and this is absolutely sort of out of left field. I mean, architectural studies at the time were always done in pen and ink. And for Michelangelo, it just shows this is a late drawing, and it just shows that he's really, black chalk is so deep in his conception of space and his articulation. So you have pen and ink and you have wash here, but he uses a lot of black chalk for when he's trying to work out the articulation of the pediment here. And what's wonderful is that he uses white heightening, this white a white medium applied with a brush to basically as a whiteout. If you remember, in the age when we all used to write and we used to make mistakes and use whiteout, this is exactly what he's doing here, and he uses whiteout to cover his previous iteration of the pediment, and then goes over it again in black chalk. And the trouble for Michelangelo is that he doesn't know that over 500 years, the whiteout is going to sort of lose its opacity and become more see-through. So now we have a wonderful glimpse into the many iterations that he's considering for this design for a door and you can see this in the exhibition. Absolutely beautiful and amazing to see him constantly sort of changing his mind and coming back to it. As we get towards the end of his career, we see in the 1540s his work for the Last Judgment, and you see the innumerable figures that were a part of it. This is on the end wall of the Sistine Chapel. And this is what reminds us of just how many drawings we don't know now and how many drawings are lost. Because, there are so many figures and so many figure groupings, and yet we have a handful of drawings that relate to them. And that's not like Michelangelo. He drew and drew and drew, and so he would have made hundreds and hundreds of drawings for a composition like this. And yet a very few remain. This is one in the British Museum. And these figures on a tiny, tiny scale, and yet drawn like mini sculptures, basically, all of them on the sheet. And, he's really just thinking through the groupings. This sheet relates to this grouping down here. But made on a tiny scale. It's the sort of sketch you would make in pen and ink, really. But he just feels so comfortable with I think it's the tonality that he can get, the different tonalities with black chalk. He can really model the figure more like a sculpture with the black chalk. And he can also get this atmosphere and depth of emotion that you just, it's much more difficult to get with pen and ink. So this is one of a series of famous drawings of the crucifixion that he made at the end of his life that seem somehow very spiritual, like sort of meditations on death. They're endless accounts of what's been, reading different things into them. But of course, we don't know really what he intends with them. But they are incredibly moving, ruminations on death and dying. I'd like to finish with just looking at what I regard as some of Michelangelo's most extraordinary sheets. And these are the sheets where he uses all the different media that he has at his disposal. And this is, for me, the greatest example, one of the most beautiful sheets in the world, I think. So he uses, black chalk, just like we saw him using black chalk early in his career for the underdrawing, for planning the composition. But then you have this wonderful use of red chalk, even pen and ink, and white heightening, a lot of liberally applied white heightening here for modeling the figure of Christ. And we don't know why he left this drawing unfinished. But one really gets a sense of a sculptor drawing in this sheet. Like, this seems like a sort of maybe an unfinished terracotta or something. And obviously the Madonna just studied purely in black chalk, and yet the Christ Child, elements of the Christ Child, highly, highly finished. And I think it's something that's very appealing to us now aesthetically, these sort of non-finito drawings, these drawings where some parts are finished and some bits are very unfinished. And it also reminds us of Michelangelo's technique with sculpture too, that he, these are two of his slaves for the unfinished tomb project. And you can see how he really isolates, pulls the figure out of the stone, and he really works up in really quite a lot of detail elements of the figure, even when he hasn't extracted the rest of the figure. So it's not a working process where you're just gradually, doing the whole figure in the round and then you polish it up. He polishes up parts, and even while some bits are totally unfinished. And that's what seems to be happening in this sheet. You get that sense of, again, bringing some bits to a high state of finish while leaving others. We at the Getty, we only have one drawing by Michelangelo, but it is, a hell of a drawing. And it's a similar sort of sheet. You have, again, a lot of black chalk studies where he has this, it's a sort of Holy Family rest on the flight into Egypt, maybe with St. John the Baptist thrown in. Scholars still discuss the iconography, but the Joseph and the donkey in the background are just sketched in black chalk. But then he works the Madonna and the Christ Child and the St. John the Baptist really highly in pen and ink and red chalk. And again, so really extracting them from the page. Somehow and really, almost scratching through the paper, just really, almost as if he's frustrated the paper isn't marble, that he can't model it more. And what's charming with this sheet is that even though you have this highly finished study on the recto on the one side of the sheet, on the other side, you have these little doodles of putti sort of playing around, and birds' heads, and this little quote from Petrarch, tempo verrà ancora, the time will come again. And so, you get the sense of him just turning over the page, using it. And it's something throughout all his drawings, that he's very parsimonious in his use of paper. He always draws on the back, and he always, will often, leaf through old drawings and think, oh, well, there's a bit of paper there, I'll sketch on that, and going back to it. And paper was more expensive, so it sort of made sense. But some of the most wonderful sheets are drawings where he uses a variety of media, but not together. So you have this early study for the steps in the Laurentian Library vestibule, but then a number of other studies in black chalk and red chalk here too. And these drawings are attributed to Antonio Mini, the idol, Antonio Mini that we encountered at the beginning of the talk. The guy who is draw, Antonio, draw, and do not waste time. So, he did draw, and sometimes, but not as well as Michelangelo, of course. So, over the course of the last 45 minutes, we've seen some of the the drawings that go into making these extraordinary works, and we've seen how drawing was so absolutely central to Michelangelo's practice across all the different media that he's working in. And there is a sense of magic of being able to make drawing do what you want and to create things from a blank sheet of paper. I just love this little caricature that for me sums it up. I don't know if you can read it. It's these two little figures, stick figures. One is saying to the other, "Someone told me we're just marks on a bit of paper." And this quizzical little question mark from the other one. And it is incredible that in the end, from a sheet of paper, you can make it be what you want to be. You can pull out figures, architecture, sculpture, everything. And Michelangelo was, just such an incredible sort of genius at doing that. And, I hope you'll really take time to look at the drawings in the exhibition. They are absolutely marvelous. So thank you very much for your attention this morning. Thank you. If any of you have any questions, I'd be happy to take a couple of questions now, if you like. Yeah, please.
Why do you think he used male models for his female figures?
So the question, why do we think he used male models for his female figures? I think there are two things. I mean, firstly, sort of availability. Like, they're right there. So they're generally studio assistants who are, it's just like, okay, stop grinding those pigments over there. Come and be Adam. Come and do this, And so they're right there. But for female figures, for Leda, it's just like, I think he just, there's somebody there. Michelangelo isn't interested in physiognomy quite as much as Leonardo. And for him, the height of beauty and perfection is the male figure and the male face. And he, there were also other conventions at the time, obviously, like, whereas now it would be perfectly normal to have a female figure, naked in your studio. In the Renaissance, that just wasn't an option, basically, like, unless it's a prostitute or somebody. Like, it's really just not the sort of done thing. So it was just much more difficult. But I think it's a question of availability. And he wasn't the only one that did that, but he definitely did it much more than others. Yeah, and yes, what was the paper made of? I'm sorry, I didn't talk about paper, but Michelangelo always, consistently, almost always used this pretty high-grade off-white paper that would be used for letters, and it would have been made probably from rags, sometimes from vegetable material. But basically rags, and there were cotton rags that were pulped down into this pulp, and then, as you know, put on a mold and sort of lifted out of the paper and, lifted out of the vat, and then pressed dry and sized as well. And it's very important that it was sized so it's not like blotting paper when you're working on it with pen and ink. And, a lot of artists in the period would use pretty rough paper, like grainy packing paper, the sort of paper that if you bought cheese or salami in Florence at the time, the sort of paper they would have wrapped it up in. But Michelangelo, he was quite particular in using almost exclusively really decent quality paper. And that may account again for his sort of, parsimonious use of it, just making the most of it as well. So I think we'll call it a day there. But if you have other questions, do come and chat to me afterwards. I'd love to talk. But thank you again so much. Thank you.